The spoon hovered halfway to her mouth, trembling slightly. A tin plate sat on her lap, steaming with beef stew, real meat, soft potatoes, and something she hadn't tasted in years, salt. Around her, American cowboys laughed over tin cups and harmonica tunes, and across from her, a Japanese woman froze, mid-step, her eyes locked on the scene. The words echoed again, louder this time, spoken with ease, like it was obvious. "She eats with us." The prisoners didn't speak. They didn't blink. This wasn't what they were told would happen. The youngest among them dropped her fork. No one moved to pick it up. Inside the wooden mess hall, the walls breathed with heat and confusion. Outside, chickens clucked in dusty coops, and a cowboy strummed a banjo like it was a normal Tuesday. But this wasn't normal. Not for them. Not after what they had survived. Not after what they had been promised, because in that moment, nothing made sense, and the shock was just beginning. The mess hall smelled of boiled beef and old wood, the kind of smell that soaked into clothes and refused to leave. Sunlight cut through warped slats in the walls, striping the dirt floor with pale bars. Boots scraped. Chairs scraped louder. At the far end of the room, a long pine table waited, scarred with knife marks and darkened by decades of meals. Tin plates were already set out in neat rows, each one reflecting the light in dull, uneven flashes. They were marched in without ceremony, no shouting, no barking orders, just the sound of boots, the creak of the floor, and the faint clatter of a ladle striking the side of a pot. The women stopped just inside the doorway. Their uniforms hung loose on them, sleeves frayed, hems stiff with old mud. Some clutched the fabric at their sides as if it might tear away. Others stood with hands pressed flat against their thighs, eyes fixed forward. Outside, a cow lowed. Inside, no one spoke. A cowboy at the stove lifted a ladle and poured stew into the first bowl. Steam rolled upward, carrying the smell of fat and onions and something warm that did not belong to war. He set the bowl down on the table, then another, then another. The sound of liquid hitting tin echoed in the quiet. The women did not move. A chair scraped. One of the cowboys pulled it back and sat. Another followed. Boots hooked around chair legs. Elbows rested on the table. They began to eat, spoons clinking, breath steaming faintly in the cooler air. No one looked at the women directly, but the space between them closed inch by inch. A fork slid across the table and stopped in front of the nearest woman. She stared at it. The metal was dull, its handle worn smooth by years of use. It looked heavier than it should have been. The smell reached her then, salt, fat, heat. Her stomach tightened, not with hunger alone, but with something sharper. Her fingers twitched at her sides. A second fork slid across the table, then another, until each place had one, waiting. The woman beside her shifted. Her sleeve brushed the table edge. The sound was small, but it broke the stillness. Someone coughed. Somewhere outside, a horse snorted. "Sit," one of the cowboys said, not loudly, just enough to be heard. They sat. The bench creaked under their combined weight. The table felt too close now, too real. A bowl was pushed toward the nearest woman. Steam fogged her face. She stared down at it, breath shallow. The surface of the stew shimmered, reflecting the rafters above. She lifted the spoon halfway, then stopped. Her hand shook. The spoon rattled against the bowl and slipped from her fingers. It struck the floor with a sharp, ringing clatter. Every sound in the room died around it. The fork spun once, twice, then lay still against the wood, its tines catching the light. No one moved to pick it up. The cowboys froze mid-bite. One of them slowly lowered his spoon, The women stared at the fallen metal as if it might explode. The girl who had dropped it bent forward, her shoulders folding in on themselves. Her breath came fast and shallow. A bead of sweat ran down the side of her face and dropped onto the floor beside the fork. A chair scraped. One of the cowboys stood, not quickly, not slow. He stepped around the table and bent down. The floor creaked beneath his boots. He picked up the fork by the handle, wiped it once on his trouser leg, and placed it gently back on the table in front of her. "Eat," he said, his voice low. Not a command, not a threat, just a word. She stared at the fork again. Then, with a hand that shook so hard the metal rattled against the bowl, she picked it up. The room exhaled. The scent hit her fully now. Grease thick as fog, garlic sharp enough to sting the inside of her nose, and a warmth she couldn't name, one that made her jaw tighten and her shoulders rise like she expected a slap. The stew hissed in a steel pot at the far end of the room, its surface bubbling in slow, fat-blistered pulses. It sat on a black iron stove, paint-chipped and slick with years of use. A wooden spoon rested across the rim, swollen from steam. Kiyomi's eyes locked on it, watching it rise and fall with the heat like a chest breathing. A cowboy stirred the pot, scraping the bottom in slow circles. The sound, a wet grind of wood on metal, made something deep in her ribs twist. Each scrape pulled her further from the moment, until she wasn't in Texas anymore. The smell of fat was replaced with something thinner, sadder. Burned rice husks, scorched black against tin, boiled weeds scooped from the cracks in a Nagoya sidewalk. Her mother had served it in silence, bowl, cradled in shaking hands, her fingers too thin to close completely. The cowboy lifted the ladle and filled a tin plate, its edges dented, surface dull and scratched. The plate was identical to the one in front of her. The same cold metal, the same weight. She touched the rim. It bit back with chill. Beside her another woman flinched. Her breath hitched when the stew hit her plate, sloshing against the edge with a hollow splash. The smell clung to them now, weaving into the cotton of their uniforms, settling into their skin. The cowboys sat first. They didn't hesitate. Forks scraped plates. Bread tore between fingers. A harmonica note floated in from outside, short and sweet, as if someone had played it without thinking. A woman across the table recoiled. Her fingers crept under the bench, as if looking for something solid. Kiyomi saw her knee jerk and press against the wood, her mouth moving silently. One woman stood. She stepped back, 2 paces only, but fast, heels scuffing, wood, eyes wide, hands open like she'd touched a stove. Her plate remained untouched on the table. The stew inside rippled slightly, the beef bobbing at the surface like debris from a wreck. The cowboy nearest to her turned, slowly. He didn't rise, he didn't frown, he just leaned back in his chair, boots planted firm, and looked at her the way someone might look at a bird caught in a screen door. He stood, boots heavy on the wood. He crossed to her. Kiyomi watched his hands, saw that they stayed low at his sides. He raised one, slowly, fingers open, and placed it lightly on the woman's shoulder. Not hard, not guiding, just a touch. "Eat," he said, his voice low, not cruel, then softer. "With us." The woman blinked. The tears held so tight in her eyes they barely shimmered. Her throat moved as she swallowed. She didn't speak, but she let him guide her back, one step at a time, until she was seated once more. She gripped the edge of her plate with both hands, white-knuckled as if afraid it would vanish if she let go. Kiyomi turned her gaze back to her own plate. The broth had settled, glistening with a thin layer of oil. The metal of the spoon rested beside it, handle streaked from the ladle's touch. Her fingers reached for it slowly, trembling more from memory than cold. She lifted it, dipped it into the stew, and brought it to her lips. The heat rushed in, first to her tongue, then behind her eyes. A chunk of carrot, soft and sweet. The salt stung the back of her throat. Her breath hitched, her hand lowered, and the spoon clinked gently against the edge of the tin. It wasn't rice, it wasn't weeds, it wasn't home, but it was food. It was warm, and it was shared. But it was food, and it was shared. The tin plate sat between her palms now, dented along the edge, warm underneath from the stew inside. Kiyomi stared at the oily film swirling across the top, catching bits of potato and stringy meat like a tide pool trapping drift. A quiet clink echoed from the far side of the table. A cowboy had sat down. One boot rested sideways on the floor, heel half off the plank, bouncing slightly as he leaned forward on his elbows. He tore a piece of bread in half with thick fingers and stuffed one end in his mouth. Another chair scraped. Another cowboy dropped into place, muttering something low about the weather and the soup. His voice was casual, the way a brother might talk to another while fixing a fence. The third came next, tossing his hat onto the table with a flick of his wrist. Dust lifted from its brim and settled on the stew bowls closest to him. He didn't notice, or didn't care. He reached for his cup and took a long swig of something dark. Then he laughed, rough and sudden, at something the others didn't hear. None of the women moved. The bench across from the cowboys remained empty. Kiyomi's knees ached from tension and the backs of her legs stuck to the rough cotton of her uniform. She could hear the wind outside hissing through the loose nails in the wall. It rattled the rafters like a man clearing his throat. Dust drifted in lazy columns through shafts of sun. A fly hovered over the bread bowl. Then a woman beside her sat. The wood let out a deep groan beneath her weight. Another woman followed. Their movements were cautious, stiff, the way a deer might step into a clearing. They kept their eyes down, hands folded in their laps, as if waiting to be struck. Kiyomi moved last, settling onto the edge of the bench. Her spine stayed straight. Her shoulders didn't touch the wall behind her. Her hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers not quite curled around her spoon. The cowboys kept eating. Their forks clinked softly, tin against tin. One reached for the butter tin and spread it thick onto a slice of bread. Another flicked stew onto his plate with a lazy wrist, chewing noisily. They didn't speak to the women, but they didn't ignore them either. Every now and then, one cowboy would glance up, eyes scanning the faces across from him. Not sharp, not cold, just there, present, as if confirming this was still happening. Then came a pause. Spoons hovered, chewing slowed. The laughter faded into a kind of rhythm, boots tapping, wind rattling, stew bubbling faintly on the back burner. The room shifted, the air tightened. Kiyomi looked at the others. None had touched their food. The cowboy nearest her looked up. He was young, 20s maybe, with a sunburn peeling along his nose and a cut on his knuckle that hadn't healed right. He met her eyes, just briefly, then looked down at her plate. Then he raised his spoon. He didn't say a word. He didn't smile. He just nodded, once, firm and quiet, and brought the spoon to his mouth. The nod passed through the room like a spark across dry grass. One woman lifted her own spoon, another followed. Kiyomi's hand rose, slow and mechanical, and dipped again into the stew. The spoon's edge knocked gently against the plate. A breath caught in her chest as she brought it to her lips. Outside, the wind blew harder. The barn door creaked on its hinges. Horses shifted in the paddock beyond, hooves stamping dust into the morning air. Inside, at that long table where enemies once stared from opposite sides of a battlefield, they ate, together, not speaking, not smiling, but eating. The spoon trembled as it rose again, its bowl shining with broth that clung thickly to the metal. Steam brushed her face, dampened the fine hairs along her jaw. The smell hit first, salt, animal fat, something sweet beneath it, not the sharp bitterness of boiled weeds, not the bitter gray water she had swallowed in silence for months. This was heavier, richer. It coated the air and pressed against her throat until her breath shortened. The spoon touched her tongue. Heat spread fast, not burning but insistent, seeping into the grooves of her mouth. Her lips parted in a quick, startled gasp. The taste bloomed, fat, onion, something faintly sweet that curled behind her teeth. Her throat tightened, not in pain, but in reflex, as if her body did not believe what it was receiving. The stew slid down, warm and thick, and her shoulders twitched as though bracing for a blow that never came. Her hand shook. The spoon clinked against the tin bowl. A drop spilled onto her wrist and ran toward her sleeve. She didn't wipe it away. The smell followed her, oil, salt, meat, crowding her senses until the room tilted. Across the table a cowboy chewed steadily, eyes on his plate. The sound of his chewing was slow, unashamed. He swallowed and reached for his bread again. No one watched her. No one waited. The heat in her mouth faded, replaced by something else. The back of her throat tightened, not from burning, but from memory. A bowl held in trembling hands. Water gone cloudy with crushed roots. Paper boiled until it came apart in gray strands. The way it stuck to her teeth, the way her stomach clawed for more, even as her tongue begged her to stop. Her grip on the spoon tightened until her knuckles blanched. The metal vibrated faintly as it touched the rim of the bowl again. A sound came from her throat. Small, broken. The woman beside her flinched and turned, eyes wide. She had gone pale, one hand clamped to her mouth. Her shoulders hitched once, twice. Then she gagged. The sound burst out sharp and wet. She lurched forward, bending at the waist, and vomited onto the packed dirt beneath the table. It splashed darkly, the smell of bile cutting through the warm scent of stew. Chairs scraped back. Someone muttered. A boot stepped away to avoid the spill. The girl folded in on herself, hands braced against the floor, breath coming in harsh pulls. Her hair fell forward, hiding her face. No one shouted. No one grabbed her. The room went very still, save for the soft patter of liquid hitting dirt and the rasp of her breathing. Kiyomi's spoon hovered mid-air. She watched the girl wipe her mouth with the back of her sleeve, shoulders trembling, chest heaving as if the air itself had turned sharp. The girl's fingers dug into the dirt, nails darkening. She shook once, then again, then froze. A cowboy stood, not fast, not slow. He crossed the room, boots sounding dull against the floor, and crouched beside the girl. He didn't touch her at first. He set a hand on the floor, steady, close enough to be felt. Then he nudged a tin cup toward her with the toe of his boot. Water sloshed inside. She took it. Her hands shook so badly the rim clicked against her teeth. She drank anyway. Some spilled down her chin. The cowboy stayed where he was, eyes on the floor, giving her the space to breathe. Kiyomi's spoon hovered again, trembling above her bowl. The stew had begun to cool, a thin film forming on top. She dragged the spoon through it, breaking the skin. Steam rose again, carrying that same thick scent. She lifted it. Her wrist wavered. This time she swallowed. Her throat convulsed once, twice. Then it went still. The spoon came down empty. Her chest rose and fell. The world did not end. The bowl remained. The table did not vanish. The men did not shout. Across from her, the cowboy nodded once, barely perceptible. The moment passed. Kiyomi dipped the spoon again. The broth slid back into the bowl in a slow ribbon, clinging to the metal before dripping away. Steam lifted, brushed her cheek, dampened the loose hair at her temple. She drew the spoon up once more, but her wrist faltered halfway. The weight of it felt wrong now, too blunt, too heavy, too foreign. The spoon clinked softly against the rim as she lowered it again. Across the table, a chair scraped. One of the cowboys stood and walked toward the stove. His boots made a dull thud against the planks, steady and unhurried. He reached above the pot where a cluster of utensils sat in a chipped ceramic cup, wooden spoons, bent forks, and two thin sticks worn smooth by time. He took the sticks between his fingers and turned them once, inspecting their surface. The wood was darkened from use, the ends blunted, faint grooves etched where fingers had held them over and over again. He crossed back to the table and set the chopsticks down in front of Kiyomi. They made almost no sound, just a soft tick against the metal plate. No one spoke. The chopsticks lay side by side, one slightly longer than the other, their tips stained faintly darker from years of food and washing. They were lighter than the spoon, almost weightless. Kiyomi stared at them, her hands hovering in the air as if afraid to touch something fragile. The bowl steamed between her wrists. The smell of broth curled upward again, insistent. She reached out. Her fingers wrapped around the sticks, awkward at first, the smooth wood sliding against her skin. She adjusted, pinching harder, the way her mother had once shown her with twigs behind their house. The motion came back in pieces, the grip, the pressure, the angle. Her hand trembled, but it held. She dipped the chopsticks into the bowl. They slipped. She tried again. This time they caught a piece of potato, slick and soft. It trembled between the sticks as she lifted it. A drop of broth slid down and splashed back into the bowl. Across the table, a woman inhaled sharply. Another leaned forward without realizing it. The room felt tighter, as if the air had drawn closer to watch. Kiyomi raised the food to her mouth. Her lips parted. The potato touched her tongue. She closed her mouth and bit down. Steam burst free. Her shoulders rose, then settled. She chewed slowly, deliberately. The sound of it, soft, damp, was louder than she expected. She swallowed. The chopsticks lowered. A breath moved through the room. The cowboy nearest her leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "You eat better than me," he said, the words loose, half laughing. He tipped his hat back with one finger and grinned, teeth flashing white against his weathered face. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, the way his shoulders loosened, the way his eyes crinkled at the edges. It wasn't mockery, it wasn't command, it was something lighter. She lifted the chopsticks again. Across the table, another woman reached for her own bowl. Her hands shook as she picked up her spoon, then hesitated. Her gaze flicked to Kiyomi's hands, to the chopsticks moving steadily now, lifting another bite. The woman swallowed, then set her spoon down and reached for the extra pair of chopsticks near the center of the table. Wood tapped against wood as she picked them up. The sound carried. More movement followed, small, careful adjustments. A plate slid closer. A cup shifted. The rhythm of eating changed, quiet but steady, the clink of metal replaced by the soft tap of wood against ceramic. Kiyomi ate slowly. Each bite was deliberate, her shoulders lowered. The tension in her jaw eased. Steam fogged her lashes. The stew coated her tongue, warm and heavy, grounding her in the moment. The bowl in front of her grew lighter. Around her, the table filled with the small sounds of eating, breaths, swallows, the gentle knock of chopsticks. Outside, wind brushed the barn walls, carrying the smell of dust and hay. Inside, the air held heat and salt and something steadier. When she set the chopsticks down, her fingers left faint prints in the thin sheen of broth on the table. The cowboys kept eating. So did she. The bowl scraped softly against the table as Kiyomi set it down. A thin smear of broth clung to the rim, glistening in the lamplight. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then looked down at her sleeve. A dark blot spread there, grease, still wet, seeping into the coarse cotton like ink into paper. It caught the light, slick and unmistakable. Her fingers stiffened. She rubbed at it with her thumb. The stain only widened. The smell rose immediately, fat and smoke, sharp and unmistakable. It was not the smell of hunger any more. It was the smell of having eaten, of having been fed. It clung to the fabric the way smoke clung to hair after a fire. Her breathing hitched. She rubbed harder, nails scraping cloth, dragging the stain in uneven arcs. The cotton darkened, absorbed, refused to give anything back. Around her, the room had begun to loosen. Chairs shifted. Someone laughed, short, surprised, quickly swallowed. A tin cup tipped and clanged onto the table, sending a ripple of sound through the space. The cowboys were talking louder now, voices rough and easy, hands moving freely as they reached for bread, for knives, for more stew. The air had warmed with bodies and steam. Kiyomi did not look up. She pressed the fabric to her thigh and scrubbed harder. The grease spread outward, feathering the edges of the stain. Her breath came fast through her nose. The sleeve grew damp, heavy. The smell deepened. She pressed her lips together, jaw tightening. A hand touched her wrist. She flinched and jerked back, nearly knocking her bowl over. The woman beside her, older, hair pulled tight at the nape, had reached out. Her fingers hovered, then rested lightly on Kiyomi's forearm. Her own sleeve was rolled up, stained with the same dark blotches. She held up her arm and tapped the spot, then gave a small, tired shake of her head. The message was simple. It doesn't come out. Kiyomi stared at the stain again. Her fingers slowed. The frantic scrubbing became small, useless circles. The cloth grew wetter, colder. The grease had soaked too deep. She let her hand drop. A sharp laugh cut through the room. One of the women, young, with a sharp chin and restless eyes, had leaned back in her chair. She was watching a cowboy struggle to scoop stew with a bent spoon. When it slipped from his grip and splashed back into the bowl, she laughed. It burst out of her, high and sudden, like something torn loose. The sound snapped the room tight. Her laughter faltered as all eyes turned. Her smile fell apart, piece by piece. She pressed her lips together, eyes darting. Another woman beside her moved without thinking. Her hand came up, swift and flat. The slap cracked through the air. The laughing woman's head snapped sideways. Her chair scraped back. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the slapped woman sucked in air, her hand flying to her cheek, eyes wide with shock. Red bloomed beneath her fingers. Silence settled hard. The one who had struck, her stared at her own hand, fingers splayed, trembling. The sound of the slap still rang in the rafters. A cowboy halfway across the room had frozen mid-step, boot hovering above the floor. The spoon in another man's hand paused inches from his mouth. No one moved. Then the slapped woman straightened. She swallowed once, then again. Her shoulders lifted and fell. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply bent, picked up her bowl, and sat down again. The woman who had struck her turned away, breathing fast. Her eyes dropped to her lap. Her hands clenched and unclenched, smearing grease across her palms. Kiyomi watched the exchange, her own hands slick with oil, her sleeve darkened and heavy. She looked down at the stain again. It had spread farther now, uneven, impossible to hide. That night, when the room finally emptied and the lamps were dimmed, Kiyomi sat on her narrow cot. The fabric of her sleeve was stiff where it had dried. She rubbed it between her fingers. It crackled, faintly. Footsteps approached. The same woman, the one who had struck the other, stood beside her bed, twisting the hem of her shirt. "Can I?" she said softly in halting syllables. "Sit tomorrow?" Her voice trembled. Her eyes stayed on the floor. Kiyomi looked at the stained sleeve, then at the woman's bare hands, red and raw. She shifted on the cot, making space. The woman sat. The smell of grease lingered between them, heavy and human. The lamps were dimmed now, their glow reduced to faint amber pools flickering against the barn walls. Outside, the wind slipped through the cracks in the boards, carrying with it the scent of dust and manure, and the low, rhythmic creak of the windmill turning somewhere in the dark. The mess table was long empty. The bowls had been cleared. The bread tin was shut. The stew pot, scrubbed clean, sat inverted on the edge of the stove. But on the table near the far corner, one item remained untouched: a tin cup. It sat upright, its rim marked with a faint, uneven smudge from lips that had drunk carefully. Condensation still clung to the outside, the last of the water inside, long warmed by the room. It hadn't been gathered, not rinsed, not reclaimed. Kiyomi walked past it, slowly, her bare feet brushing against grit and straw that had blown in through the threshold. She reached for the cup without hesitation. Her fingers wrapped around the handle. The metal was lukewarm, light, thinner than it looked. She turned it once in her hand, then held it to her chest, just below the collarbone, the rim pressing gently against the hollow of her sternum. Her other hand cradled the bottom. She stood there for a moment, the heat of her palms softening the chill of the metal, her eyes tracing the groove where the cup had been soldered at the seam. It hadn't been counted. No one had stopped her. She brought it to her bunk. The cot was stiff, the wool blanket folded neatly at the foot. She sat slowly, setting the cup beside her, balanced on the wooden crate that served as a table. It teetered for a second, then settled. She reached for the blanket and drew it over her lap, then placed her hand on the cup again. She didn't move it. All around her the barn whispered, cattle shifting in their stalls, the wind moaning against the siding, the rustle of straw as another woman turned over in sleep. But Kiyomi sat upright, fingers resting on the rim of the cup. She did not grip it tightly. She did not drink from it. She simply held it, as if anchoring herself to something solid, something that could not be taken. She lay down with the cup beside her. The crate was low, just level with the edge of the mattress. The cup's base made a soft metallic sound as it bumped lightly against the wood. She adjusted her blanket, curling onto her side, her back to the wall. Her hand reached back once, found the cup in the dark, and touched it. Then she closed her eyes. Morning came slow and gold, slanting through the barn like syrup. Dust hung in the air, catching light in motionless specks. Somewhere outside, a rooster called, sharp and grating. The windmill creaked again, steadier now, catching wind from the south. Kiyomi stirred. The blanket fell from her shoulder. Her fingers reached immediately, instinctively, for the object on the crate. The cup was still there, exactly as she had left it. The metal had cooled again, but it still held the warmth of memory. She sat up. Her joints cracked from sleep, and her legs ached from stillness. She picked up the cup and walked to the spigot at the back of the barn, where a metal bucket of water sat covered with a lid weighted down by a brick. She lifted it gently, her hands pale against the cold. The water poured slowly into the cup, splashing with a clear, hollow sound. She brought it to her mouth and drank. The water was clean and sharp, laced with the flavor of tin. Her eyes fluttered shut. When she lowered the cup, her lips were wet, and she smiled. The warmth of the water lingered behind her teeth, mingling with the metallic tang of the tin. As Kiyomi placed the cup back on the crate, a soft knock echoed from the barn's main door. Not a fist, just knuckles, careful, deliberate. The hinges groaned as it opened, letting in a sharp wedge of sunlight that spilled across the dirt floor and stirred the morning's dust into dancing gold threads. A cowboy stepped inside. He moved slowly, cradling a tray in both hands, the wood stained dark with steam. The smell followed him: flour, butter, fire, biscuits. They weren't like the ones she had seen in Tokyo bakeries, white and glazed behind glass. These were rough, with flour still clinging to the cracks and edges browned unevenly. The tops were shiny with grease, the bottoms dusted with ash. The cowboy set the tray on the nearest table with a quiet thunk, then nodded once and turned to go. He left the door ajar behind him. Wind curled in and carried the smell across the barn. Women stirred. Blankets rustled. Kiyomi watched them rise one by one, slow and cautious, eyes drawn toward the tray, but feet still rooted. No one rushed. Hunger had taught them patience. She stood and walked over, her bare soles whispering against the packed earth. There were no rules spoken, no orders given. The tray sat open, unguarded. Kiyomi picked one biscuit up. It was warm, surprisingly heavy, and slightly oily to the touch. Her fingers left small prints on the crust. As she turned it over, a crumb flaked loose and tumbled to the floor. A woman beside her reached out. She didn't say a word, but her eyes met Kiyomi's, just for a second. Then she looked away again, gaze dropping to her feet. Kiyomi hesitated. Then, slowly, she tore the biscuit in half. Steam puffed out from the center, carrying the rich scent of butter and lard. She held out the larger half. The woman stared at it. Her hands moved slowly, trembling faintly as she took it. The crust crumbled slightly in her grip. She pressed it to her chest, then looked back at Kiyomi with lips parted like she wanted to say something but didn't trust her own voice. Instead, she stepped aside, cupped the warm bread in both palms, and turned to another. She broke it again. This time, a third woman received the smallest piece, tucked into her fingers like a secret. The ripple began there. Others came forward, no pushing, no greed. Each pair of hands took, broke, passed. The crumbs fell freely, not guarded like rations, but surrendered like offerings. A girl with sunken cheeks held out her piece to the woman who had slapped her days earlier. The woman blinked, took it, and bowed her head low. The tray emptied slowly, not from hunger alone, but from something gentler. Kiyomi sat again on the edge of her cot, her half of the biscuit resting on a strip of clean cloth. She picked at it, bit by bit, letting each piece sit on her tongue long enough to dissolve. The taste was simple: flour, fat, salt, but it lingered. Across the barn, a cowboy leaned against the open doorway, one hand curled around a cup of coffee. He didn't speak. He watched with eyes narrowed slightly, not from suspicion, but from the sting of morning light. The breeze lifted the hem of his shirt. The barn was quiet, filled only with the sound of chewing, the shifting of blankets, the low scrape of boots against wood. On the table, a single broken biscuit remained. Not full, not untouched, just enough to mean something. Kiyomi reached for her tin plate, the one she had used the night before. She placed the last piece of her bread onto it and set it beside the cup. The two objects sat together now, plate and cup side by side, not tools but tokens, and around her the women sat not in lines but in circles, no longer waiting for permission. They ate at the same table. Boots struck the wooden threshold like a gavel, sharp, final, unexpected. The barn fell silent. Every motion froze mid-gesture, hands curled over bread, spoons hovering, mouths half open. The head guard stood in the doorway, framed by the sun like a figure cut from iron. His face was unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Dust spiraled up around his heels. His eyes moved slowly across the room. First to the empty tray of biscuits, then to the tin plates still in use, then to the women, seated not along the walls, but with the men, cowboys with wide shoulders and sunburned faces, laughing softly, nodding, sipping black coffee from enamel mugs. One woman looked down, another gripped her chopsticks tighter. A third shifted her weight, uncertain if she should stand. The guard's brow lifted, just barely. He took one step forward, then paused. A cowboy seated nearest to him leaned back on his bench. He had straw in the corner of his mouth and oil on his shirt. His hat was pushed back, and he didn't bother to move it. He gestured with a nod toward the table. The bench groaned under his shifting weight. He didn't rise. He didn't flinch. "She eats with us," he said. His voice was gravel and smoke, but the words dropped into the barn like a stone into a still pond. The ripples were invisible, but they moved through everyone present. Even the cattle in the stalls shifted, hooves clacking once against the boards. The guard didn't answer. He didn't have to. He simply turned, slowly, and stepped back out into the sun. The door creaked once behind him and fell shut. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the clink of a spoon, then another. And like a wheel creaking back into motion, the room resumed its rhythm. But something had shifted. The tension that once sat thick between bodies had thinned. The invisible wall, the line none of them had dared cross, was gone. There had been no ceremony, no announcement, just 5 words, spoken like a shrug. "She eats with us." Later that afternoon, as the sun melted toward the west and the air filled with the scent of hay and horse sweat, Kiyomi sat outside the barn with her back against the warm wood. Her fingers traced the edge of her plate, still slightly greasy from the morning. A younger girl sat beside her, picking at the laces of her worn shoes. "Why did he say that?" the girl asked softly, in Japanese. Kiyomi didn't look up. She plucked a small pebble from the dirt and rolled it between her fingers. The rough edge scratched against her nail. The question hung between them like smoke. Because they weren't supposed to. That's what they'd been told, over and over, since they were little girls in classrooms back in Nagoya. Americans weren't human. They were beasts, wild, stupid, dangerous. The kind of creature that would eat raw meat and smile with blood in its teeth. That's what they'd learned. In the leaflets, in the newsreels, in the lullabies twisted by war. And, yet, he had said it like it meant nothing, like it was obvious. "She eats with us." That night, as they gathered by lantern light, the phrase passed from cot to cot. Women whispered it to each other like a secret blessing. A few even repeated it aloud, testing the words on their tongues. They didn't say it in English, not yet, but the sound of it lingered. It was more than permission. It was something new, a kind of defiance, but soft, quiet. By morning, one woman had carved a small line into the wood beam above her bed, just beneath a row of tally marks. She didn't explain it. She just stared at it with her fingertips on the groove. She eats with us. It would not be the last time the words were spoken. The dock creaked under her shoes, real shoes, not the canvas rags they'd worn through the desert summer. The wood was dark with seawater and old oil, crusted at the edges with salt and tar. Ahead, the hull of the repatriation ship rose like a wall, its metal skin rust-flecked and scarred, but proud. The air here didn't smell like cattle or coffee or hay. It was sharp and briny, a cold wind whipping in from across the Pacific. Kiyomi stood still for a moment before the ramp, her pack slung over one shoulder. The rope ties were stiff from sun and dust, and the pack's belly bulged with what little she was allowed to bring. A folded shirt, a coin given to her by a nurse, one photograph curled at the edges, and beneath it all, wrapped tight in a rag from the mess hall, a tin plate. The plate had been scrubbed until its dull gray surface gave off a faint, uneven gleam. A shallow dent in the corner remained, formed not from a fall, but from years of knives and spoons tapping too hard. Her chopsticks fit neatly atop it, wrapped in the same cloth. There was no regulation against it. It wasn't contraband, but it wasn't on the list either. Still, no one stopped her. Behind her, the women filed forward, hair tied, backs straighter than when they'd arrived. Their uniforms were faded but no longer threadbare. Some spoke in whispers, some didn't speak at all. One of them hummed under her breath. At the edge of the dock, near the chain-link fence that separated the loading zone from the open ranch, a figure leaned on the post with one arm. A cowboy. The same one who'd first said it, weeks ago, in the barn, like it was nothing. She eats with us. He hadn't shaved. His hat tilted slightly back, revealing the lines etched at the corners of his eyes. In his other hand he held a chipped mug of coffee that steamed against the cold breeze. Kiyomi didn't wave, but she did pause. She turned fully, facing him, then bowed, not a deep formal bow, but a short, precise nod, the kind her mother once gave to a stranger who gave up a seat on a crowded streetcar. The cowboy lifted 2 fingers from his hat's brim and tipped it, almost imperceptibly. Then, without turning, he took a long sip and looked out toward the sea. The ramp vibrated under her step. The steel handrails were cold against her palm. Each footfall echoed slightly, swallowed by the wide belly of the ship as she stepped into its shadow. Inside, the air was thick with oil, iron, and the scent of old bread. The hum of the engine pulsed in the walls. Kiyomi moved past rows of cots and metal trunks until she found her assigned bunk. She set her pack down carefully, fingers still pressed to the cloth wrapping the plate. She didn't unwrap it. Not yet. She just sat, feeling the weight of the ship preparing to move, and the different weight in her lap. Small, but solid. A plate that had once belonged to no one. Now it was hers. Outside, the American coastline shrank into horizon fog, but she didn't look back. Not this time. Her shoulders were broader now, her cheeks fuller, her body no longer just skin stretched over bone. And in her bag, carried across an ocean not as a souvenir but as proof, was something they could never confiscate. Not metal, not ration, but dignity, folded, wrapped, and taken home. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. And if you believe that even the smallest gestures can change everything, like this video, because sometimes all it takes is a plate.